Right, good evening everyone. Thank you for staying awake and alive long enough to hear me. As already been said, I'm going to talk about how to solve social engineering attacks, which is a project I'm working on at the moment, and how I'm going to achieve it through modelling, categorising and converting the attacks. So to give you a bit more detail, first I'm going to tell you a bit about myself. This is the first time I've presented at a conference, so I want to give you a bit of background on myself. There's some words you need to know. There's obviously quite a bit of terminology in social engineering, some of which is generic, and if you've done it before, you might know, and some of which I've had to come up with to explain concepts. We're going to look at the why. Why do we actually need a solution to social engineering? I'm going to show you some models. The whole project's kind of built around models. There's quite a few doing different things, and we're going to look at what they do, how we can model social engineering attacks, and how they work to help us solve it. We can categorise the models so that we can end up with definitive categories for different types of social engineering attack. We can then convert, the idea is to get a solution. To do that, we convert the attacks from social engineering attacks into something else, and that allows us to find a solution. And I'll finish up by looking briefly towards the future, what you can do to improve or extend what I'm going to show you here. So first of all, who am I? I'm not going to give you my whole CV. But as already been said, I'm a final year student at the University of York in the UK. I'm studying computer science, and this project's actually my final year project. That's got its plus sides and its negatives. On the good side, it means you can theoretically trust what I'm saying as being very academic, it's scientific, everything I've done has got justifications behind it. I'm not going to show you these justifications, but if you want to ask me about it at the end or afterwards, I'll happily explain them. On the downside, it means it's a very short project. I've only been working on this for a month or two, maybe three, part-time, and I've only got another month or so to go. And so there's an awful lot more that could be done in the future to further this. And finally, I'm also the intern for First Defence Information Security, which is a pen testing and social engineering firm. So things you need to know, the dictionary, as it were, to my talk. We're going to start by looking at what do I actually mean by solving and social engineering. Then there's social engineering generic stuff like attacker and mark. And finally, some project-specific stuff, attacks and stories. What do I mean by solving? As the picture shows superbly, that is not a solution in the proper sense. There's a number of problems with it. If the bottle breaks, if you can't read English, or if the person inside can't hear you when you're shaking it, the solution isn't complete. As I'm trying to do this academically, I'm looking very much for a scientific definition of solving. I'm trying to find something that always works and will solve everything. Now, obviously, solving all of social engineering has its limitations. It's not necessarily possible, but I'll come back to that. The aim is to find something that solves all social engineering attacks. What do I mean by social engineering? I'm not talking about computer viruses infecting humans, however awesome that might be. I'm really talking about, as the quote goes, deception. For me, social engineering boils down to deception. And so if any of you who are based in the UK and have seen the BBC programme Hustle, or The Real Hustle, show of hands? Okay, a few of you. The show is all about confidence tricks and confidence artists, i.e. con tricks, conning people and hustling them to get money usually. I don't really make a distinction between con artists doing con tricks and social engineering. And because at the end of the day, they're both doing the same thing. They're both deceiving somebody to achieve a goal. And so that's effectively the definition I'm going with. Using deception to achieve a goal, whatever the goal may be. Then some social engineering generic stuff. The mark. This is the person who's being deceived, the victim in the attack, as it were. The mark is always a singular person. Certain attacks, you might be able to think of some, have multiple marks. For example, a phishing attack. I could send out one email to 1 million different people. For the purposes of my models, I'm considering each mark to be a separate model, so that you're considering individual marks. The reason for this is we're looking for a solution, and so we're looking at it from the mark's point of view. We can't be multiple marks at the same time. Attacker is the social engineer. This is the person actually doing the deception. I'm going to use the term attacker most of the time because I really don't want to say social engineer every few seconds. This can be plural. Again, as you'll see later on, it doesn't matter whether it's a single person or a whole group of people doing the deceiving. You can just consider it as one person. some very project-specific stuff. If you consider a social engineering attack, let's take an example. The attacker has this goal. He wants to achieve this. To do that, he's going to make 3 phone calls. He's going to ring person A and ask this question. He's going to ring person B and get this bit of information. He's then going to ring person C and use the first 2 pieces of information to achieve the goal. That whole thing I've just described is the story. It's the entire incident from the attacker's point of view. We're interested in the mark's point of view. So each of the individual phone calls is an individual attack because each one has an individual mark. And so what we're trying to look at are the individual elements. The reason for this is obviously if you can stop one of the attacks, the overall story won't work anymore. And so to solve social engineering attacks, as long as you can solve one of the bits, one of the things that make up the overall story that the attacker uses to get to his goal, you can stop social engineering. What's the point? There is the very famous quote that no one's quite sure who started, because there is no patch for human stupidity. And it's very apt. Users as a general thing are very naive, they tend to be inexperienced, and they're usually ignorant of the correct things to do. There's training out there. There's some great training out there for social engineering, but it can't be perfect. No matter how good the training is, it will never achieve perfection, because what you are effectively trying to do is make people aware of their own weaknesses and how to fight them. That's not really a solution. That's trying to fill in the blanks, as it were. What we're looking at, if you look at the diagram, if you've done software engineering, which I'm sure some of you have, you'll recognize this as the sort of problems you face. Training's ever going to be bottom right. It works, it does its job. There's a variety of issues with it, though. We're aiming very much for bottom left. We want something that's cast iron that will do the job. How are we going to do this? We're going to ignore psychology. If you've ever read a book on social engineering, looked on any websites, talked to anyone, or gone to any talks at conferences, people will talk non-stop about the psychology behind it. You should take advantage of this emotion. Use this weakness in human behavior. If you read somebody's body language like this, you can achieve this. Put on this fancy costume and you'll become someone else entirely and they'll all believe you. Well, I'm sure a lot of you have done it. The old hard hat, yellow jacket, in a suit with a briefcase on the phone. You can use psychology to achieve social engineering. The problem is it's too complex. It's almost impossible to model social engineering, including the psychology, because there isn't enough paper in the world to put it down on. The reason I can ignore psychology is because we're going to make the assumption that it will work. No matter, after a certain amount of psychology, after a certain amount of social engineering, the attack will succeed. If we assume success, then we can black box the psychology, because we're going to assume that it will work, and we've suddenly got a much simpler model. And so that's then something we can then solve. So how am I actually going to go about doing this? Where am I going to get these models from? Well, I start with war stories. I went to the library, which as a BSc student is a very scary place, and I read books. I looked on websites and started reading all the stories of actual social engineers who've been out there, who've done it, and have written down their exploits in a book. And I started documenting them. I've documented about 100 so far. And I'm going to took these attacks and then modelled them. When I modelled these attacks and removed psychology and then did a bit of abstraction, it turns out there's 4 models that cover all of the social engineering attacks. Now, amazingly enough, 4 models is reasonably solvable, and so that's what I proceeded to do. But first, a bit of a disclaimer. If in the 100 attacks that I've documented, I've missed something, then anything I show you from here on in is the beginning as opposed to a complete solution, which is, as I said at the start, what we're aiming for. Let's continue under the assumption that I've got it right and we haven't missed anything. And as you see, I don't think I have. And if you can think of any examples of a social engineering attack that isn't shown in my models, please yell it out or say it at the end. I really don't think you will. So as I say, I took the models and we abstracted them. We removed all the stuff, we took out all the irrelevant stuff, but as both the picture and Einstein very wisely say, we didn't go too far. There is still enough detail in them for them to be relevant and to be important. The good news is it meant because you remove psychology, you can strip out a lot of details that otherwise would be important. For example, if a social engineer tries to contact the mark on the telephone, or in person on the street, or via email, In each of those scenarios, the mark's going to react differently. But we're ignoring psychology. And so it doesn't matter. You can ignore how the attacker actually does the things he does, providing you acknowledge that he does indeed do them. So let's look at an example. The first attack I'm going to show you is this one, which is all to do with information. I'm going to lose the mic, and I'll speak up. This model shows...
Hang on, can I give you this mic so we can get a video, right?
Okay, this model shows information. The mark is trying to, the attacker is trying to get information off the mark. Now there's two types of information I've modelled. Public information, which is not necessarily published, but simply information that you could get legally without necessarily doing any social engineering or hacking. And private, which is everything else. Now obviously in a company or in the military, private's going to be broken up into different levels of confidentiality, but for the purposes of the model, they're all encompassed within private. At the top, as I was mentioning earlier, you've got the contact, you've got these two boxes, which is the attacker contacts the mark. There's two. The reason there is two is because the first one is the attacker contacts the mark. This is fairly normal. I ring them up, I speak to them I speak to them via email, whatever. The other one came about when I was reading a Kevin Mitnick book. And Kevin Mitnick, in case you don't know, is a very famous American social engineer who's been in and out of prison and turned good guy and has written loads of books about the things he's done legally and illegally. And in one of his stories, he altered a telephone switch so that a number that normally went to a police office, so that police officers could get information, actually went to his mobile phone. Needless to say, the marks rang the number and were directed to his mobile phone. And from a psychological point of view, they immediately assumed he was a police officer, he is genuine, we can tell this guy stuff. No, in fact, he's a social engineer. Hence why there's the second box, the attacker gets the mark to contact them. You'll notice down the side, the psychology boxes. This is, as I said, I've black box psychology. We've acknowledged it there. At every stage, the social engineer may have to do something, may have to do some convincing, may have to use some tricks, but we'll assume we go through. On the far left, you'll notice in the dots, the negative case. We're assuming it works. They're there for clarity so you can see where it could fail, but we'll take them out later because we're going to assume the attack works. The final thing I want to mention is at the bottom. The two boxes. The mark realises they've been attacked and the mark doesn't realise they've been attacked. Those of you who've watched the Hustle, or the Real Hustle, will be aware of the terminology burn the mark. If an attacker burns the mark, it means the mark has realised that they've been attacked. They realise they've done something wrong. They've realised the attacker has managed to get them to do something they shouldn't have done. It is vitally important for an attacker nearly all the time to not burn the mark. The reason for this is if the mark is burned, it means two things. First of all, you can't use the same attack again in the future because the mark's going to be onto you. Secondly, another attack in the story may not work. The mark might go and tell his boss, I feel really stupid, but I just told this guy on the phone all our private information, and they're going to do things to fix it. Now, admittedly, if you know the statistics, that rarely happens. People like to keep very quiet that they've made such a stupid mistake, but it could potentially influence the story. And so it's vitally important most of the time that you end up in the mark doesn't realise they've been attacked box. The next model is all to do with gaining entry. As you'll notice, the entire model is identical except for the two middle boxes on the right, where effectively the goal has changed. Now, what do I mean by gaining entry? Well, I could mean it in a physical sense, i.e. you're trying to break into the premises. For example, tailgating, where you follow someone through a door, or they hold a door open. Or as one of my favourites is when you turn up to a door that you're supposed to put a card in or you're supposed to put a PIN number, carrying loads of stuff or on the phone, and somebody sees you and they take pity and they let you in. And it's very useful. It doesn't, however, include things that aren't social engineering. For example, if somebody walks through that door and I run up and just catch it before it closes, that's not social engineering. That's catching a door. Unless you've actually deceived somebody to take advantage, unless you've deceived someone and are taking advantage of their weaknesses, it's not social engineering. The other example of gaining entry is the virtual side. Getting into a system, getting into a network, whatever it may be. Now, I've got to make a very important distinction here. If I ring someone up and ask them for their username, for their password, and they give it to me, and then I use that to log on, that's not gaining entry. That's the previous model. That's information. because they've told me what I wanted to hear. If I, however, ring up a sysadmin and say, I work for your company in Department X, I'm away on business and need VPN access, I've locked myself out or whatever, can you create me a new account? And they do it, you've gained access. You've convinced someone to effectively open a virtual door into their system, specially for you. Next model is all to do with malware. We've just had a talk on malware, and here is effectively the model that describes the social engineering aspects of it. The mark is asked to access the malware. It's a bit of a cover everything box, because it includes not only techniques like if I send someone an email with a malicious attachment, but techniques like baiting. If I stick some malware on a USB stick and leave that in the car park, or if I, before you guys came in, dropped USB sticks with malware all over this room, I suspect by now there'd be a lot of angry people in here, because people would have picked them up, plugged them in, and gone, damn. That is included in the asked to access the box. You don't necessarily need to contact the mark in order to do it, hence why there's the direct line to that box. The mark accesses it, not much use if he doesn't. The malware gets installed. Now this box wasn't originally there, because obviously if the malware installs itself, if all the mark does is open the attachment or plug in the stick and immediately it gets installed, that doesn't need to be modelled, because it's not part of the social engineering attack. However, we've all had times where we've either used or come across malware where the user has to actually do the install. It's a Java applet, they've got to click allow or install. It's a piece of malware that's disguised as a legitimate program, and they run through a standard install system. There are numerous examples of this, hence why it's there, because if you've got to convince the mark to do the install, you've got to be able to model it, because you've got to be able to model the psychology and the social engineering aspects of getting them to do the install. The final model is pretty much everything else. Perform an action. I ask someone to do something specific. The example that caused this model is another one from Kevin Mitnick's book. It was a guy rang up a telephone repairman and said, I've got a new copy of your company directory, which has all the confidential numbers that the public don't have access to in. But I can't deliver it to you until I've got your old company directory back. So stick your old one out on the porch, and I'll grab it when I drop off the new one. Needless to say, the old one went and the new one never turned up. You've asked somebody to do something, he's gone and done it, or she's gone and done it. So we've got these four models. We can consider these categories. Effectively, that's what they are. They cover, theoretically, all social engineering attacks. But the reason they're rather different to what we would normally think of as categories is that they're categories based on the goal of the attacker, what the mark's actually got to do to let the attack succeed, as opposed to the methodology that the attacker uses. Normally, we think of things like phishing, which is a technique that an attacker uses. It's not much good when we're trying to think, how do we solve this? You can't solve phishing. But thinking about solving the malware, we know how to stop things. We know how to stop people accessing malware. We know how to stop malware getting installed, as you'll see later on. So as I say, the aim here with considering them as categories is that we're trying to, as the analogy I'm using is that we're trying to cure the cause and not just the symptoms. We can put them all together and end up with a nice big model that is effectively what you've just seen. They still working? Yeah. And as you've still got, basically, your information model, your perform an action, your gain entry, and your malware models. But you've also got a big line going round and an attack at the box. I don't know if you can read it. It says the attacker begins the story. If you think back to when I started the talk, I was talking about attacks and stories. This model, rather than just showing all of the attacks put together, actually shows the stories. Because obviously the attacker can go through one attack, loop back and do a different attack, and so on and so forth. If this is complete, this is rather useful, because we can study this, we can do work on this, because this theoretically shows all possible social engineering stories, anything an attacker could do using social engineering. But we want to solve it. So to do that, being young and being British, I'm going to use something I've labelled the Blue Peter principle. Now, for those of you who don't know the UK show, the Blue Peter, it's a kids' TV show that's been running for, it must be at least 30, 40 years. And they're famous for arts and crafts and making little things out of plastic and pieces of paper and old egg cartons and things. with the catch line, here's one I made earlier. They'll tell you what to do, and then they'll pull out a finished one from under the table. This is exactly the philosophy I wanted to use to solve social engineering. Rather than try and invent solutions on the spur of the moment, just come up with some miraculous cure, I thought, let's use what's already been invented. What's already been invented? Computer security solutions. And so what I've done, as you're about to see, is I took social engineering models I should have shown you, converted them into models of the corresponding computer security attack, and then researched the current industry best practice solution. So, to do this, it's rather simple. We just do a bit of translating on the models. You don't have an attacker, you have a hacker. You don't have a mark, you've got a system. Now, we don't need to specify whether it's a network, a web app, a system of some description. You don't contact a system, you connect to it. Psychology becomes hacking, and you alter a few details so it reads nicely. Now, I'm hoping you'll be able to see this model. That is basically the model we just saw a few seconds ago, minus the link back arrow and everything translated. You've still got the same layout. You've still got the system is asked for private information. You've still got the system actually gives the hacker the information. You've got the perform an action. For example, we could think of that as SQL injection, for example. Command execution. You're trying to get the system to do something it shouldn't do. Gain entry. Hacking into a network, hacking into a web app. And malware is pretty much still malware. So we now start looking for the best practice solution. So we'll look at them one by one. If we look at information, what do we usually do if we've got a system and somebody asks it for information, how do we confirm they're allowed the information? Well, we authenticate them and we confirm they're authorized. It's something we've been doing on websites, it's something we've been doing on networks since day one of computers, hence why it's there. With gaining entry, how do you stop someone gaining entry into your system? Well, you can have a firewall. You can close any unneeded ports. You can use an access control system. Again, if they've got in, if they've connected to your network, you can then authenticate them and confirm they are authorized to access that server, access that part of the web app, whatever. And if they do succeed in getting through all that, you can at least make sure you know about it. You can use an IDS. Malware. This is easy. We've all been protecting ourselves against malware for donkey's years. You can restrict removable media. I know it's easier said than done, but suddenly a lot of techniques, especially all the ones I was mentioning about USB sticks, don't work if you can't plug them in. You can scan traffic. You can use an antivirus. Keep the antivirus in your computer up to date. And just standardize the software. Don't let your employees do whatever they want. They've got a lot lower risk of being infected with malware. And finally, perform an action. It's the same thing. Authenticate, authorize. It's the same stuff over and over again. It's the same stuff we've all been using with our computer security for years. It's nothing new I'm showing you on these few slides. All I've done is research it. But now we want to take these solutions that we've researched and use them for social engineering. So we've got to convert them back. We've got to go back to the real world, as it were. We go back from hacker to attacker, back from system to mark, back from connect to contact, back from hacking to psychology, possibly alter a few bits, and ensure the solution still works. Now, this is where it gets a bit difficult, and I draw a very wiggly line over what I'm going to do what I've done up to this point and what still needs doing, probably by someone in the industry. It's kind of the implementation of the system. I've come up with the framework, I've come up with how you can do it, but actually converting those solutions back is a really big problem. As you're going to see in a second, the solution has got to meet the definition we came up with at the beginning. It's still got to be complete. It's got to solve all possible cases. It's got to always work. It can't introduce any errors. It can't go wrong. And as we all know, that's exactly what security solutions do. If this is an example, if we look at, we're back into the social engineering information model, we've still got the same solution, but if we think back to the computer world, we've got the problem. We've got websites and networks that are secured with, say, username and password, i.e. they confirm you're who you say you are and that you're allowed in. But most of the pen testers, and probably almost everyone in the room, will have come across situations where the logging doesn't work. It's been implemented incorrectly, some programmer forgot a line of code that's vital, there's some minor mistake that means you can get around it. The implementation is bad, it doesn't work. For this to work, the implementation needs to be good. Now, just going back again, one other thing I wanted to say. Using this sort of solution for information is something that the military have been doing for a very, very long time. If I rang up the US Joint Chiefs and said, hello, I'm Barack Obama, I would like to launch a nuke at Russia, they're not going to let me do it unless I can confirm that I am Barack Obama and that I'm allowed to launch a nuke. Now, I don't know US military as well as I should. If memory serves, they've got to be at DEFCON something or other before he's allowed to do it. If they're using this system, why aren't we using it in businesses? We've got the solution, we know it works because they use it, but we're not using it. Wrong way. Gaining entry. You can't use a firewall. You could use a security guard. They work very well if they're well trained. You can't close ports, but you can close entrances and exits. How many social engineers climb in through a bathroom window that hasn't been locked properly? Access control systems. The tube, the metro, any of those travel networks tend to use barriers to stop you just wandering onto them. Why do we use barriers in business? Make sure they actually work. Often when we do use barriers, just like on the train systems, they're ones that you can jump over or climb under or just push through. Finally, you can authenticate, and are they who they say they are they authorized to do this? And an IDS system, you mean something like CCTV, a way of physically telling if someone's doing stuff in your business. It's no good just having it in the lobby. If a social engineer goes upstairs into your server room, you want to know what service he's playing around with. It's no good wandering in, seeing that he's unplugged one cable and assuming that's it, when in fact at the back of one of your racks he's plugged in a USB stick with malware. Malware, oddly enough, the solutions are exactly the same. Restrict removable media, use an antivirus. It's stuff we've been doing for ages, but we don't do it very well. Now, I realise I'm being very mean, as it were, to the industry, because I'm talking theoretical as opposed to real life. These solutions are supposedly academic, and so this is what you could do to prevent the problem, as opposed to here's something you can actually take into a business and it's guaranteed to work. Perform an action, it's the same stuff. Authenticate, and are you authorized? And we can put them together. Now, this is kind of the ultimate goal, to come up with a model like this that shows all possible social engineering attacks, and more importantly, shows the solutions. Because we can then start using this as policy. We can take this to a business and say, let me implement this for you. Or if you're in a business, to your bosses, let's implement this. If we implement all these red boxes, theoretically, we're no longer going to be at risk from social engineering attacks. It's much better than saying, let's send all our guys off on training. We'll probably have to do it next year again, and they'll have forgotten it somewhere in the middle, but it's better than doing nothing. Well, let's try and improve on that and do something that's even better than the training. As you've probably guessed, there are still a few holes to fill in. This is by no means complete, and I suspect it won't be for a very long time. You can improve on it. You could go back to the beginning and do it all again with more detail. You can start with more attacks. You could put together models that have more information and more detail in them. Obviously, there's the whole huge question of implementation. How are you actually going to use this? At the end of the day, that's the whole point. The whole point of coming up with ideas like this, the whole point of trying to improve the world, is for people to use it. If you look at the number of people who are still vulnerable to security problems that were solved 5, 10, even 15 years ago, it's shocking. Let's try and not make that mistake with social engineering. If we come up with a solution, let's try and get it out there. Let's try and get people using it. Even if they use it badly, it's got to be better than not using it at all. And so that's kind of me done. We started out right at the start with war stories. Obviously, as I say, you can start with a lot more war stories than I have, but as I say, I think I've got them all. You can make some models. You can model the social engineering attacks. You can model the conversions into the computer world. You can bring the conversions back. You can abstract. It's vitally important you abstract. If you don't abstract, you're never going to succeed, but you could abstract either more or less than I have. You need to convert them. The conversion process I used was as simple as I could make it. The reason for that is the simpler it is, the less likely something's going to go wrong, or the conversion process is going to introduce errors. You could potentially come up with a better conversion process. And then you can solve it, then you can come up with an implementation, and then you can use it. Take it out there and get people using it. Okay, thank you, and I think I've got time for questions.